So today, I'll be focusing on three things. First is I want to talk about what we have done in the past recently. How many people here use Service Manager today? Just a show of hands. Awesome. So February 2014, I kind of blogged about my core priorities for the rest of, let's say, 18 months. I'll very briefly talk about that, how we are actually showing up and delivering against those. I'll also talk about some of our investments and how our partners are helping us get to the hybrid cloud scenarios. We'll spend a little bit about some demos around those. And earlier in this year, or sometime last year as well, the last 6 months, I've been traveling a lot, meeting customers, and I saw some very good best practices in those customers. And I thought this is a good time to actually synthesize those best practices and share it back to the community at large, because some of the conversation that I have with our customers, each and every problem is different, but they also share something common. And I thought, Kathleen, myself, and a few other people even actually wrote a book about it last year, but this is a continuation of the same theme. If we can somehow capture and communicate distill those best practices back to the community, I thought everybody will benefit. So there'll be a session around that as well. Hopefully it'll be useful for you for having showed up on a Friday afternoon. So as I mentioned, I want to share a little bit about what we have done, a little bit of what's coming up, some multi-cloud, multi-OS environments in which System Center is used today, particularly service managers are driving force behind those. We'll talk about those as well. And lastly, how do I really extract value from an existing service manager deployment? That's not just the technology focus. It's also a little bit about what business processes that you have to take into consideration as well. So with that, I've shared this before. So if people who have been in the service manager probably know that we went dark sometime around 2012. It's known. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. We did go dark, and we actually came back. And when I resurrected the team back, had an opportunity to actually go drive a new culture. With the new team came with a new culture. And it was an opportunity for me to actually go back and drive some of the things that I always wanted to do, and the team actually cooperated with me. We not only talked about agile outside, we became agile inside, and agility actually mattered. And you can actually see that downstream. I'll show you some examples of that. And one of the things that when we went agile, not only change our engineering system and engineering culture, we had to become extremely metrics driven ourselves, right? So with numbers, with measurements, came agility. And the other thing that I'm most proud of is along the way, I became very, very comfortable being extremely transparent. I shared what I had. I said, okay. Not only did I share, I asked. And the community actually responded, both the customers and the partners in the ecosystem. And together, I feel very good in terms of the progress that we are making. And I think that is a culture change that you actually see it happen over and over again in other parts of our System Center brand as well. We had a product meetup Wednesday at 4 o'clock. Somebody here must be here. Somebody actually raised their hand and asked our director, how come other components of System Center are not doing the same kind of community engagement, communication as Service Manager is? So at least this team and this community is impacting other aspects of our product. So our director actually promised that, okay, we're going to actually do the very similar things in other aspects of our System Center product as well. That's a positive change. And as I mentioned before, we are extremely committed to our ecosystem. You'll see an example of that today. We have two partners, one talking about best practices and one actually building a gap in our offering today, which we critically rely on. And this by no means, when I say committed to the ecosystem, we are very, very dependent on them, not only in terms of filling our gaps, but also feeding us a lot of their learnings into our product. And you actually see that going forward. I briefly mentioned that we became agile. What it meant to us was we became a backlog-driven culture. When I rebooted Service Manager in early 2013, I had a mountain of debt to climb. And to be honest, there is no single method to go back and approach that. I had to make some really hard decisions. And what I did this time around was very, very rigorously focus on a backlog-driven culture. And not only backlog where I sit in the room and think about myself and decide how to approach this was actually very community-driven. Every month we actually go in front of our community. We put things that we think ought to be done. The community actually prioritizes itself as to what needs to be done. We take it back to the next level of sprint. So, and it's not just the community, that external customers and partners. We rely on our internal support organization as well. I have a lot of meetings with the MVPs. They help us. The most important thing that you see here is what's called an Agile TAP. That was actually started in February 2014. Agile TAP is something that I'm extremely proud of. We have 104 plus people participating in this ecosystem where they get every 2 weeks, they get a build of Service Manager. And partners like Cyrus and partners like GridPro not only consume these bits, they have changed their own development cycles because of the periodicity and the predictability in which we are able to drop them so that they are able to go back and SIMship when the bits actually leave, when the UR is released, you can actually be very, very sure that the partner bits are also working with them. Provence actually works with these bits. In the past, that was not true. I can tell you that I've been with Service Manager for a while now. It wasn't true. In fact, I had many meetings with Provence where they said, hey, you need to let us know earlier. And those things kind of changed when we decided to go back and make this a very dedicated means by which we approach our ecosystem. And I call it co-create at the time, where we and the community are doing this together. But the most important thing here is we do this weekly, and we are able to change our engineering system to actually give out builds every 2 weeks, which can be upgraded seamlessly to our partner ecosystem. The public doesn't get it because you have to be part of the TAP in order to get it. But the TAP itself, the URL to register yourself, is public. I reject very few things that I reject. If people are not very clear about what they want to do with those builds, I kind of say, hey guys, you may not be the right part. If somebody says, I'm extremely passionate, I tested, I give feedback, that's all it takes for it to be in the program. And the only other balance that I do in this program is 75% of that composition to be MVPs, SIs, and partners, and 25% customers. And I want that balance only because the MVPs, SIs, and partners are heavily dependent on the product to be actually working, and the customers actually benefit out of that. So I try to keep that ratio, but other than that, and we grew from a handful about 12 when I started in February to about 104 plus where we are today. And I don't reject that many, but I do reject a few. And this was the biggest one that I'm able to give predictably and we internally we call it TAP Thursday. And Thursday comes, internal drop happens, communication happens on Friday, and sometime around the weekend, people actually get the bits. And we actually respond back within 2 weeks, and the best thing that you get out of this is a UR that actually works. And there are going to be times when we are actually taking a lot of risks in these builds. There are times when the UR actually may not work, but we optimize for recovery as well. In this agile world, it's only fast forward. I need to go back and keep giving and then improving it. One thing that you'll actually notice out of all these is we're going to deliver bits faster and faster cadence. You're going to even start seeing features come in through these things. So the core things are one engineering team, one backlog, and the biggest challenges last year that I faced was with a UR, should I go completely customer focused and not do engineering development at all, or should I balance? And there's a lot of tension in the team. And we struck a nice balance to say, hey, 40% engineering improvements, 60% customer-facing value. I'm very, very happy to say with UR6, our engineering backlog is also cleared up. So you're going to see more and more features and more customer-facing values. Mostly 100% customer-facing value is very, very close by. I'm very happy about that. And then that was the last point, talks about investor and test automation. We spent a lot of time in making sure that the test automation framework is geared up for fast release. In 2013, I did a survey among a lot of different customers, and then identified the core challenges that they had. And I'm basing and at that time, I made my priorities and what I'll work on and what I'll not work on, most importantly. And you're going to see those things play out. And with the UR8 coming up, I think most of my stability as well as performance work would be most likely complete, leaving me open to feature improvements, and we'll talk about that later on. The key thing that I want to show here is a circle that says partner dependencies. A lot of people complain about partner dependencies, saying that, hey, service manager, I need to buy this, I need to buy that, and very legitimate. But when I put the trade-off in front of them, saying that, do you want performance improvements or do you want to take partner improvements? And then the trade-off was always go fix your core engineering hygiene work. And I'm still standing behind that. We are not too far off in getting our perf done. And you'll see that we're starting to invest in other areas. This is something that I thought you guys should at least know. I collect a lot of data, what's called as usage data. I said we are metrics driven. As part of the metrics, I also not only do have to know operational metrics, I know how the product is being used. This is something that where service manager is used today. Majority, as much as a lot of people are going to claim about change management and release management and other things, the SQM data that I gather continues to tell me that 99%, this mix is, the combined here is about roughly 90 to 98%. Majority of the scenarios are around incident and service catalog, and that includes service request as well. So if you're feeling that you're not using other aspects of the scenario, or if you're using it, I'm not knowing it, this is a good time to tell me. But most likely, these are the two scenarios that I see largely being used. And this is where all our usability improvements or performance improvements are also going to come. Even though we don't necessarily go back and say, let's improve incident. It's the hygiene that gets improved. But when it does get a chance, when toss up, we actually go back and use this data to improve. Very quickly, the only thing that you should take away from this, I know it's a little bit noisy, not there in the past, that is with the new team and new culture, we have not missed any URs. That was not the case in 2013, not the case in 2012. With the new one, every 3 months we show up. And we show up every 3 months because we show up in every 2 weeks earlier than that, right? So it's just a progression of showing up. We just released UR6 sometime back. It has the theme of UR6 was performance improvements, performance particularly around connectors, and I'll go into detail a little later on. Again, this is a very targeted effort. We want to improve the hygiene. We're very, very happy to say we have 50% plus improvements in performance in the connectors alone, and this is only going to continue. We want to start focusing on DW and other things coming up. Because it's agile, we have not actually planned out what UR8 and UR9s will look like, but that's also an opportunity for us to actually start thinking about features more than so there are a lot of different toss-ups being talked about. Should I do HTML5 portal? Should I build an SMA connector? Should I do that? None of those things have been actually dotted, I's dotted and T's crossed. We'll come back to the community. We're going to go put up for vote. We're going to ask, where do we start thinking? It takes about 6 to 9 months for us to actually flush it out. It's a good time to actually, we have the luxury of, at this point in time, to actually start thinking about it. So sometime in the next few weeks, you'll actually start seeing such conversations happen. It'll be transparent. You get a chance to vote. Very quickly, this is the graph that I want to impress on you. The orange line is the reduction in time pre and post UR6. If you're wondering, hey, I did not do UR4, I did not do UR5, it doesn't matter. You pick up UR6, it's cumulative. All the URs build on top of the existing URs. You're not losing anything by not picking up. If you like a feature, take it. If you don't like it, if you don't like a particular feature, wait for the next one. This train will continue to show up. It's cumulative. This is the one we have done a lot of internal testing. This is one of the biggest. It took 3 URs of work that you guys did not see happen in order to land this in this current UR. But this is, again, a testament to the focus that we actually go on. So very, very happy this happened. Along the way, we also added SQL Server support. The next one that we are talking about, this one is, again, metrics driven. I just want to very quickly give you a comparison. In 2013, I gave you here an example of a sample graph. That is the adoption curve in 2013. Ever since this program was put in place, when we started re-engaging with the community, put more resources, you can actually see two things happen. It's stabilizing at a higher rate, and it's getting there faster. The x-axis shows you the quarters. So we're able to get people more and more faster to a much, much higher stabilization point. The small green line may be very invisible for you is the latest UR. I track it almost daily. It's growing. It's in the cluster of the UR, so I'm very, very happy where it's settling down. So please download it. Please check it out. Give us feedback. But just it serves as an illustration of if you actually put your efforts, if you actually target, the community is responding back. Very quickly, what's coming up? I said UR8 and UR9s are not being planned. These are the items that we are thinking about, not done yet. Customers and ecosystem, I mentioned we have about 104 plus members in the ecosystem. If you're interested, there are some URLs you can sign up. The only commitment is you'll get bits every 2 weeks, and you can just test it out. We have monthly calls. Be very active on Twitter, and we also blog about it. So, and this information is available. You can sign up. You can engage with us. This is something that I just added this slide just this morning. In the booth, a lot of people are asking me for some books. I actually co-authored one of these books myself. I actually wrote the foreword, but a whole bunch of other people actually did that. So check it out. It's free, but it actually gives you the getting started guide on Service Manager. It also gives you the things that you need to optimize on. And so far, I have about 29,000 downloads on these books. That could be because of many reasons, but if you can just ignore the big numbers, it's still being actively downloaded. So what does it mean? Here's what happens. The net of all this is I meet a lot of customers. People are telling me that the confidence of the ecosystem is flowing to the customers. And when I meet them, they're saying, oh, you got the right priorities, stay focused, don't get distracted, and it's flowing. And that's the only thing that the velocity may not be as fast as you think, but its direction is very, very on spot. And now, with all the hygiene work almost getting close, you can even see improvement in velocity on that. These are the two major things that most people hit me with. What is a self-service portal, and what's the strategy? It's very possible that we can actually, sometime in the next month or so, we might even be starting to announce what our technology is going to be. The Silverlight portal, we can actually come back and say, hey, that's going away for sure, and this is how it's going to look like. We are not yet ready to announce it yet, but very, very close to come back and say we're going to do something around that. Another big one that people are most interested in is IT management as a service. Are we actually going to take SM into the cloud or not? It's still an ongoing conversation. We wanted to lock it down in November. We couldn't. We tried a February time slot. We couldn't. And hopefully, my management is telling me that by June, we'll have locked it down. So there is still active conversations happening, and you'll probably keep on the lookout, reach out to me. It's certainly a top line item for not just me. It's also for my management and all the way up. And this is a high-level conversation. That's where it's getting sitting right now. The latest commitment that I've heard is sometime around June, July, we'll have a position on it very quickly. So it's looking good. I feel excited about it. This was not something that even happened last year. So this year, the fact is happening. I'm super excited about that. So with that said, I'm going to take over. I'm going to invite Patrick to come and take over. He's going to show you some demos. I mentioned the next 45 minutes will be all about demos and best practices. We're going to talk about how Service Manager is used in multi-cloud environments. If you have heard the term cloud broker in the past, if you heard cloud management platform in the past, if you heard self-service in the past, Service Manager is backing up all those things. It's used in traditional data center scenarios as well as in cloud scenarios. And Patrick, help us out with those scenarios.
Absolutely. Okay. Thanks for having me here. I'm very glad to see so many people here. So we're going to talk about service management around the multi-cloud scenario. Okay, so we have resources on-prem, and now we're moving to the cloud, public cloud and private clouds, multiple public clouds. How do we manage those resources no matter where those are? Because there will be a need for management. There will be incidents occurring on-prem. There will be incidents occurring in the public cloud. You need to do proper change management of your resources to be able to track back and see what has been done to those resources, right? Okay, so a while back, Microsoft released Windows Azure Pack, like last year sometime or in the beginning there. Windows Azure Pack is Azure technology that you can run on premises. So it's a portal platform that is making use of technology that has been proven in the public cloud. So GridPro, the company that I come from, we decided to build on top of the Windows Azure Pack platform and make Windows Azure Pack able to use capabilities that are available inside of Service Manager. So we have the service catalog that we are heavily depending on in this case, and we are able to interact back with work items from that portal. So I'm going to be showing you how we can do that and how we can enable management and self-service around resources spread over multiple clouds. So I'm going to show you a scenario where we are actually allowing users to use this on-premises portal to go and request a resource to be provisioned in the public cloud, in Azure. And we're going to include an approval in this process. And this is also something that the Windows Azure Pack platform benefits a lot of, because in Windows Azure Pack, you get a lot of native capabilities like going and creating VMs and websites and so on for your on-premises cloud. But there is no concept of review activities and making approval and so on. So you're missing that piece of control in the processes. So by using the request management for Windows Azure Pack, we allow you to make use of those capabilities coming from Service Manager. Okay, so once the request has been reviewed and approved, this is going to be creating a service request in Service Manager, as you're used to. And Service Manager is going to fire off, well, sorry, the service request has been created much earlier. But once it's approved, SMA runbook. So you could be using Orchestrator, of course. In this demo, I'm using SMA, Service Management Automation, since we have a connector for that. So that will enable us to go and provision a resource in the public cloud. Then I'm going to take that a step further. I'm going to actually go and show you how can we do change management of a resource that has been provisioned in the public cloud. So we're going to see how you're able to interact with resources that is basically in the public cloud, but represented in your CMDB as a configuration item. With that said, let me switch over. Okay, so I'm now inside of Windows Azure Pack. And I'm logged on as a user who only has access to those capabilities that Service Manager is providing into the Windows Azure Pack portal. So you could actually be seeing out-of-the-box capabilities like VMs, websites, databases, and stuff here. So there's a lot of things that I encourage you to look into when it comes to Azure Pack. Out of the box, it's free from Microsoft. But the things that we add on top of that is the requests, activities, and resources. So that is what we're going to focus around right now. So if I want to go and make a request based on a request offering in our service catalog of Service Manager, I would go and click Create Request. And today, we're going to request a web application. It's actually going to be provisioned in Azure. So we click Web App, We read through the description. Everything is coming from the service catalog of Service Manager. And we come to the form. So this is based on the configuration that you do in Service Manager, out-of-the-box capabilities. On top of that, we've added some new capabilities. When you install our extension for Windows Azure Pack, we push in some management packs into Service Manager, which allows you to actually go and hook up PowerShell scripts behind this form. So we can make it a bit more interactive. So we're actually pulling down templates here from Azure. So I'm selecting one of my web application templates. I get a description. I'm going to enter a name. So let's try the Contoso. And this is actually now being validated against Azure. And that name was already occupied. Strange. So let's go for Ignite Demo. Huh. 34. There we go. We're going to choose the location for this to be provisioned. And of course, you can make this more of a, well, apply your business logics and how you want the user experience to be. So we had a demo running earlier this week where we actually asked, for what purpose do you want this resource for? And based on the purpose, if it was for development or production, we made the selectable values further down in the form based on that previous value. I hope I have time to show you that later on. But in this case, we're going to move on. We're going to just enter an email address here for alert information. So Azure can use its alert capabilities to send notifications to our email there. And we submit the request. Okay, so we now have a new service request that contains all of the information that was entered in the form. It's represented in Service Manager, of course, as this service request. As an end user, I can track this request in the Windows Azure Pack tenant portal. I see the description, all of the user input, and I also see the process, right? So this is coming from the service request template inside of Service Manager. And I can see that there's a review activity, and then there's the create web app activity. So let's just refresh this. It was going to be updated there, but I want to hurry it up a bit. There we go. So the review activity is in progress. That means that someone needs to review the request, and for demo purposes, I am the reviewer of this. Normally, it would be the cost owner, for instance, or some other instance that needs to review the request before it's actually fulfilled. So as a reviewer, I'm also able to use the tenant portal here to go and review the request. I see the information coming here, some instructions. I need to look at the parent work item. So I'm clicking a link here to the right, and I have access to all those. All the information was entered in the form. I'm pleased with that, so let's go and say OK. So this means that Service Manager will now actually go and fire off an SMA runbook that will go and provision a web application in Azure. So I'm in the preview portal of Azure here, and we're actually going to see a notification pop up here on the left-hand side in a while when the runbook has been completed. What we're also going to see is actually a CI showing up as a business service. So this is a complete application that we're deploying now in Azure. So it could contain a database, a website, a VM, for instance. It's a complete template that we're using for provisioning. So I'm representing that as a business service. You could, of course, represent it however you would like. If you want to use custom clauses or whatever, that is all supported by this solution. But we will see a new CI pop up there in a minute. While we're waiting for this to happen, I want to show you briefly inside of the service catalog of Service Manager, we have, of course, our configuration of this offering, where we say which questions needs to be answered, what is the title of our offering, the icon, and so on. But what we've also added is something that we like to call advanced configuration. So this is the basic that we are used to see inside of Service Manager. And there are questions. And now we have access to advanced configuration. And in here, we're actually enabling you to say, I want to visualize costs in the form. I want to have a legal acceptance text, which will be injected into that wizard experience at the last page. You can do some UX customizations here if you want to divide questions into different pages and set headers and so on. And this is also where you say, I want to fill that list that I added to my offering with data coming from a PowerShell script. So in this case, it's hooked up to get Azure Web App Templates.ps1. So behind the scenes, when someone fires up that form, this will actually run that PowerShell script and retrieve data for you. So this means that you don't have to have all the data in the CMDB to be able to visualize it in the form. The other thing I want to touch briefly is that we're actually enable you to do something like online validation, which you saw when I entered that website name. So there's the validate website name.ps1. That is what was used to actually go and validate it. Last thing is that you can have dependencies. So you see the template description actually being populated as soon as someone has entered a value for choose template. You see that there's a refreshed by list there. So you can actually configure dependencies between questions. So that is what enabled that experience. And here we go. So we have a new notification in the portal, which means that that SMA runbook has now finished. And if we look at that, there is a deployment called Ignite Demo 34. And here is our resource group containing the web application and some application insights capabilities. This also means that we have a configuration item called Ignite Demo 34. This also means that on the tenant portal now, we have under resources, which we've just added to the product, a representation of the Ignite Demo 34. So this is a way for you to say, if I have people in my organization that are responsible for different applications and so on, or resources, they can now interact with those in a self-service manner and go and manage these. So for instance, if I click into this, I'll actually see a details page, which is customizable. So you can define what information should be showing up here, but it's coming from the CMDB. You also get the possibility of adding actions. So down here, based on what type of CI you're looking at, you can actually have different actions. So in this case, I want to show you that we're able to have create change request, for instance. So I'm doing a change for my resource. I want to track that, of course. I want to have the approval. Let's initiate a change. And you see me coming into that wizard again that is representing the service catalog. But this time, I actually have some context. So it tells me that you're doing this for Ignite Demo 34, which means if I now go into this form, I enter a reason, rollback plan, priority. And when I get to select what is the affected resource, it actually points out that it should be the Ignite Demo 34. And now I've created a change, which means if I go to related items here, there is our change request. So you can actually manage your cloud resources in a way which you should be able to manage resources no matter where those are, in your private cloud or in the public cloud. You need to do your processes, right? And this enables your users, if you want to, you can delegate some parts of that out to the tenant portal here. And you can even add actions like, I want to scale out the website. You can add that kind of actions onto this page. Just briefly before I summarize this. On the admin side of this portal framework, you're able to add your own custom actions, and you do that and associate those with CMDB types, so configuration item types. And those will light up on the portal. You can actually even fire off runbooks directly from there. So if you want to do that scale-out task, fire off a runbook and go and do your automation. It's totally available right now. So with that said, let me jump back to my slides here. So, using the capabilities of Windows Azure Pack combined with capabilities of Service Manager and the capabilities added by GridPro, we now have a way to provide service management for multi-cloud resources. Building this on top of this portal framework for your private cloud coming from Microsoft also gives us claims-based authentication, so you can actually have partners or customers accessing the portal. We now have added that resource lifecycle management that you just saw. That portal framework also collects information about usage. We're providing information like minutes spent on incidents and so on, so you can actually use that for billing of customers or internally. And this also actually gives you the possibility to do some multi-tenancy scenarios which haven't been possible before, since we're using claims-based authentication and everything is actually hooked up around subscription model that Windows Azure Pack provides. I would be happy to answer questions on that later. Now, to hurry things up a bit here, I just want to say reach out to gridprosoftware.com if you want to learn more about these products, or contact me. There's my email address, and I will make sure that you get the information. With that said, Shrikant.
Thank you, Patrick. A great hand to him, please. It's an awesome demo. So you saw the capabilities of Service Manager along with our partner extensions. We will continue to go back and support those scenarios. This is only possible because investments from Patrick and others in GridPro has actually enabled me to focus on the core hygiene of our product. And that's something that I'm very, very thankful for. So with that said, I want to really invite Nate. Nate, as I mentioned earlier, I've been visiting a lot of customers earlier this year and as well as late last year. And one thing that I found in common was a lot of best practices that Nate and his team have implemented across our scale deployments. And I thought this was a good time for Nate to actually come in and help us. How do I extract the maximum value, both from a process standpoint, what considerations that go into the process side of it, which typically gets ignored when you actually go do technology speak. And in an ITSM product like this, process has a much bigger impact before you go down the technology aspects. So I requested Nate to actually talk both about the process side of thinking that he implemented in those scenarios, as well as the technology behind it, and also give a brief sense in terms of how do you want, if you want to leverage Azure, that's also something that you should possibly consider for your deployments. So with that, Nate, can you help us with your scenarios?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Have the clicker? Sure. Thank you. Hey, everybody. All right. I guess I consider this the keep you out of the mud or get you out of the mud part of this session, right? You're either planning your implementation, or you are in the midst of your implementation and you're in the mud and you need to get out, or you're successful and need to make you even more successful. So my name is Nathan Lesnowski. I've had the opportunity to do several implementations of Service Manager over 100,000 users, which has been pretty cool. And what I'm going to talk about today is the relationship between your project and the processes that go into making that project successful. I also have a ridiculous amount of content in this slide deck that is going to help you scale your implementation. I'll cover that for about 10 minutes. Please take a look at the slide deck after the presentation to extract a lot of the details. I'm never going to have enough time to go through every single one in minute detail. And then the final thing I'm going to cover is going to be using business analytics against your Service Manager environment to provide value back to your customers. So one of the things I find pretty often is that people are really good at getting data into Service Manager, but they're not so good at getting data out of Service Manager. So they don't really show their managers, their CIOs, their VPs, what the heck IT is doing, and I want to show you how to actually go about accomplishing that in a pretty easy way. So just as a show of hands, who currently has Service Manager installed today and is using it in production? Okay, so about 70% of you. Who's currently planning an implementation of Service Manager? Okay, the other 30%. Great. So some of this is going to apply more so to those that already have it deployed. Some will apply more to those that are going about the planning process, and we'll just drive into that right now. All right. So what's the first thing you need to know? First thing you need to know is that your project is not just about ticketing. Your project is about becoming an IT service provider. An IT service provider is an organization that delivers something to the business that the business actually needs. It's the exact opposite of the way IT has traditionally functioned. IT has traditionally functioned as a black box that gets money and outputs something, but the business really has a hard time articulating or understanding what that something is. We want to change that. We want to make IT transparent. We want to make IT an organization which is a business enabler. So you want to become, as a component of deploying Service Manager and your journey in doing that, you want to be able to enable your business to understand what you do, and you want to enable yourself as an IT organization to be able to support what you do. So that means 5 things. It means that you are responsible for the strategy of what you're doing. So if I'm delivering a customer ordering system for my business, I'm responsible for the fact that I have a strategy around delivering that customer ordering system. It's something we've agreed to as a business. And I have architecture that I'm going to use to actually go about accomplishing it. You're responsible for the requirements that go into delivering that service to the business. You're responsible for consulting the business and consulting around what the technology decision should be in delivering that to the business. You're responsible for acquiring the technology, which might be going and buying software or provisioning some Azure websites or deploying some applications that you've built internally. And finally, you're responsible for continuous delivery. You've built the website, it's out in production, now you're supporting it as an operational entity, and that's where your ticketing system comes in, right? So when you think about Service Manager, a lot of people think about, we're way on the back end of the life cycle in operations. Service Manager serves the entire life cycle. It serves everything from strategy to continuous delivery. So when you're looking at your service management project, think of it in a cyclical way. So think about it as a service life cycle where you're starting with strategy, going to design, transitioning into operations, which would be your change management. Then you're actually in the operational state, which is where you've got incident management, you've got problem management, and then you're feeding right back into continuous delivery process. And you're enabling that process to be fully successful in your business. This making sense? Yeah? Cool. All right, so before you deploy the technology, stop. And here's some things that you should do. First, fully define the business process that's being built. I engage with 2 different types of customers. One type of customer will tell me, we just want to install the technology, and we'll just help us install the technology, and we'll take it the rest of the way. I know that customer will fail. I know that customer will fail because I can tell just by talking to them that their mindset is entirely about using a platform like this just as a technical tool. But this isn't just a technical tool. It's a process tool. It's like building out a workflow in your business. You need to understand the workflow before you build it. Otherwise, you're going to build it 6, 7 times before you make any progress. So fully define the business process in a Visio before you get there. Create functional requirements that tie to that process. Functional requirement would be like, my work pattern, my incident form needs to capture the affected user and needs to display this information so we can validate their location. And if I don't have that, I will not be able to be successful in serving their incident management needs. Define that before you build it rather than as you're building it. Define a testing matrix to prove that you're successful. So once you've gone through this process, define, here's a relationship between the process that I just defined and the test that I validate. So then when I release it to production, I'm actually lined up and I know what I'm doing. So as you get more into agile development, this becomes even more necessary. And then ready the organization for change. You may have built the best system in the world, but if you haven't readied the organization to use it, you're in a pretty serious spot. If you haven't readied the organization to use it, you're just sitting there and you put this tool out there, but they don't know how to use it. They're not enabled to use it. You haven't sent out communications. You haven't given them training. It's much more than just deploying a technology. All right. So what we're going to do is I'm going to walk through a couple deployment architectures. Now, this may be drastically larger than your scale, and that's fine. So some of these concepts, you can just kind of choose your own adventure here and determine how these apply to your local implementation. Let's start with what does performance mean when we're looking at a deployment architecture? From my perspective, it means that incidents, problems, changes close quickly. It means that they're closing. If you're in the console, it means they're closing in, say, less than 5 seconds. If you're in a web console type experience, it might be a little bit somewhere around that same space, maybe 4 to 7 seconds, depending upon what you're actually doing. It means that portal performances are fast. It means you have to have a limited please waits. You need to have submission completing without failures. For automations, it means that your automations need to execute on time and within the time frameworks that you defined as a business. And then for reports, it means that reports can be defined quickly within the expectations you set for your business. So if your report is used for managerial access during the day, that means that you probably need to get refresh report data every hour. So in order for that report to be successful, it means to refresh that data every hour. If it's something that's for long-term trending, then maybe that's not quite as important. Maybe you can run it every month. So those expectations need to be defined up front. These may be slightly different expectations than what you have. Define that for your business, but define it ahead of time. What does scale mean? Scale means mega-sized customers. We need to be able to serve that environment. We also need to be able to serve your environment, right? So we need to be able to serve customers that have, say, 200,000 users. We need to be able to serve data centers that have 50,000 servers. We need to be able to serve geographically dispersed environments, millions of incidents. These things are really important when you're very large, but they're also important when you're very moderate in size too, because they're the same concepts. So what does the architecture actually look like? Now, don't try to take notes on your piece of paper or whatever. Certainly go back and just take down the slides. We divide this up into segments. An important aspect of scaling is making sure that you take your environment and you break it into logical parts. So let's start with our management servers. Management servers run about 4 to 8 cores. But one of the things I want to focus on here is not so much the actual numbers of cores, but if you're deploying this on-premise, you kind of have a lot of control over some of these aspects. If you're deploying it in Azure, there's a couple of things you really need to be aware of. Who in here is looking at an Azure-based deployment of Service Manager right now? A couple of you. Okay, great. So if you're deploying this into Azure, there's kind of 3 principal differentiations you need to be aware of. There's the differentiation between the A-series servers and the D&G, and there's types of storage that you use, and then there's the allocation of types of disk. Those same qualities are important on-premise too. So what is an A-series server? A-series server is the least expensive server type in Azure, and it provides you with moderate performance, but not the maximum performance. In cases where you can serve moderate CPU needs, but don't need significant disk performance, A-series servers are a great fit. That's where our management servers are on A servers, right? However, our SQL servers are the characteristic of a successful Service Manager deployment more than anything else is your SQL server healthy? Is your SQL server not healthy? There's a couple really good sessions at this Ignite about SQL Server performance. Go watch those sessions, because if your SQL Server isn't healthy, your Service Manager environment is going to be pathetically slow. So you need to be able to serve that. So you're noticing here I've got 16 and 24 cores. I've got 32 plus gigs of RAM. I've got high-performance disks. If you're doing this in Azure, use a D or a G series server, because that allows you to be able to use premium storage. So the premium storage gives you validated storage performance, and it also can give you SSDs. So that's pretty beneficial. So if you're deploying this in Azure, make sure that you're using the D or G series, but then also make sure you're allocating specific disks to those drives, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. Data warehouse servers are very similar. to the other SQL servers, they're segmented from the traditional SQL server. Do not put those on the same SQL environment. Separate them into their own SQL environments, please. That will provide you a lot better performance, and it'll also let you segment your workloads. For your Office 365 or WAP or SharePoint Web Content servers, pretty similar to the management servers, you could use the A or the D series. And then for Orchestrator and Runbook servers, you can use D series Azure servers, or I'm actually starting to recommend using Azure Automation. Who's gone to an Azure Automation session this week? Most of you? Great. Azure Automation is awesome. You should use it. You should be playing with this next week. This plugs right into Service Manager with either the SMLets, or if you're just pulling from SQL, you can do that too. All right, so what's our topology? Topology is try to double up on everything if you're trying to do a highly available deployment, especially one where you're serving most of your customers' business processes, right? So you notice in my deployment, I've got lots of SM connection servers. I've got content switches, which actually allow me to be able to distribute amongst these different servers. And I've got dedicated boxes that fulfill certain roles. Also have a SQL Server always-on cluster. Always-on clusters tend to be a really great direction to go, but you have to watch out for things like networking. If you have sketchy network connections within your data center, that can cause some pretty serious problems within always-on connections, always-on topologies, so you need to be aware of that. Make sure you're using a dedicated workflow management server, dedicated console servers, and dedicated management servers for the actual connections of your users as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about SQL Server configurations. TempDB is the single most important part of your SQL environment as relates to Service Manager. Everything happens in TempDB first. If your TempDB is slow, your SQL Server will be slow. Put TempDB on fast disks, please. That's why I'm talking about using the G or the D-series servers, or if it's on-premise, make sure that your TempDB is on fast disks, and make sure you're loading up your server with enough RAM to be able to fulfill those short-term needs. Your TempDB performance will determine how fast your Service Manager environment is. Your Service Manager database, test your performance before you put it into production. I have a nice, anybody used SQL.io before? Yeah? Cool. So SQL.io will let you run synthetic tests against the disks on which your SQL database lives. This will allow you to be able to go out and say, what does my SQL performance look like? I bet you that my laptop has faster SQL performance than your SAN, because my laptop runs an SSD and your SAN doesn't, or might not. So one of the things that you should think about is testing your SAN, determining what kind of actual performance you're getting out of it, and then discerning how you can improve that performance within your SAN infrastructure, especially if it's a shared thing that you're sharing with everybody else. Run that command, go ahead and test your environment. RAM allocation, make sure that your SQL Server has been specifically set up to not grab all the RAM. Make sure you allocate your SQL Server to have only a portion of the RAM, so you retain it for the actual OS. Make sure your SQL broker is set up. If it is not, your workflow performance will be terrible. This is a really common support request issue, so make sure you go out and check your SQL broker. There's the command to actually go testing your SQL broker, and then here's how you change it back. So make sure you test that today if you're using Service Manager in production right now. Also check it when you're deploying, because this is something that does not get enabled by default in clusters. It's something that you have to enable yourself. Define parallel processing rules in SQL. Here's what SQL does. SQL Server takes all your CPUs and it makes them available for queries. Well, let's say that I've got a really monster query. What does SQL Server try to do? It takes all of its processing power and it allocates it to that query. That can be really bad if you have one gigantic monster query running. Let's say it takes 30 seconds to run, right? What's happening during those 30 seconds for all your console users? They're getting nailed. They can't do anything, right? So what's really important to do is you switch your parallel processing modes on your SQL Server to be able to use they basically tell SQL Server that it can only use 1 CPU or 4 CPUs per query. What that allows you to do is to say, I don't care how big your query is and how much work it needs, isolate it to this quantity of CPUs, and then reserve the other ones for everybody else. It's really important in scale environments. If you don't do this, you start to run into problems, and you start to run into things you didn't necessarily know you were going to run into until you hit them. So It's basically called the max degree of parallelism. You may actually be running this in other environments too, but it's certainly something that you should be aware of. Also, make sure read committed snapshot isolation is on. Read committed snapshot isolation is on by default in Service Manager, but make sure that you have validated that it continues to be on within your environment, because if it's not, you'll also suffer poor performance. Validate your normal statistics around RAM, disk performance, CPU, and then also validate your groom settings, ideally that you're running them on a regular basis against your changelog, and also as you're grooming out of the operational database at a regular interval that fits your needs. Check your log size for expansion. So does your log, I've run into this as well, where organizations have defined their transactional log in a way that is not set on simple. So let's say it's set on full. What happens when it's set on full? When your transaction log is set on full, it continues to grow until it's backed up. That's not that big of a problem, actually, if you're backing it up frequently enough. But let's say you do a really big operation. What happens? It grows and grows and grows and grows and grows until it runs out of disk space. So what a lot of enterprises like to do is they like to say, we allocate 20% of the overall size for our transaction log. But if it's a really big operation, you may actually eclipse that and take your entire environment down. So you need to be aware of making sure that you are allowing enough space for a transaction log to grow, and also providing the opportunity for it to be reduced in size on a regular basis, that or switch it to simple. If you're using an always-on configuration, you can't use simple, though. You have to use full. So there's some characteristics there you need to be aware of. And then also, finally, check your indexes. At scale, Service Manager sometimes needs additional indexes added to it. Do that in conjunction with Microsoft support, though. Don't just do that by yourself. Yes? We could probably do a blog post on that. I don't have that in this list, but yeah, that's a good point. Thanks. For high availability, use SQL 2012 always on. Now supporting SQL 2014, actually, so we don't need to use 2012 anymore. CU6 supports availability groups, as well as SQL 2014. Really nice changes happening there. All right, user experience. For the self-service portal, pick the right user experiences, right? So for end users, self-service requests, interactions, use low training mechanisms like a self-service portal. For the console experience, make sure that you have high bandwidth connections. They need to be, say, less than 100 milliseconds to get to your target. If it's not, you're not going to have a great console experience, right? The team has done a really nice job of enhancing the performance of the console in the latest URs. That's something where there's a lot of challenges before. I think they've done a really good job of enhancing that, and we're seeing better and better performance within the context of the console. But if you have very lossy connections, or you have very high degraded connections, what you're going to experience is poor console performance. So use remote app associated with that. There's a lot of sessions on that today. There's also some good experiences you get from GridPro or Cyerson for their web console experiences, which I tend to use in almost every implementation of Service Manager. For console optimization, make sure you're using UR6. That allows for you to get around some bugs that exist in the console in the earlier URs, right, earlier versions. Minimize the quantity of views and the sizes of enums as much as possible. That allows you to optimize the way in which your forms load. And then also use searching versus views. Views tend to return a lot of data a lot of times. Searching allows you to get information out that's very specific. So there's a couple examples of that. And then also limit the number of people that are inside of your global operators group. This is something that can drastically improve performance. If your global operators group is too large, it starts to cause a lot of degradation, so be aware of that. Use basic views. In the environment, what you'll see, and we've done some demos on this out in, if you just Google it or Bing it or whatever, there's difference between basic views and type projections. A basic view returns only the data that exists within a class. A advanced class or combination class, it returns the data that's in the class itself and then the relationships that have been defined within a type projection to other classes. Out of box, when you go to the views, you'll see something that says incident advanced. One of the big mistakes I see people using is they actually use that in constructing their views for Service Manager. The problem is that that is the relationship between the incident and about 12, 14 other classes. So if you have a lot of data in your system, it actually sounds really good when you're building it from scratch because there's no data in the system. But once you have, let's say, 1,000 work items, like that's not even that much, but let's say you have 1,000 work items, using your advanced class, returning that relationship to all the other classes in the system, it's like asking for the entire database to be returned every time you hit that view. It's a terrible idea. Don't do it. So there was, a long time ago, actually, published some nice additional classes that are more specific type projections that allow for you to get that data back. So I've left the links there, and you can go out and install those management packs in your environment and use those for your views instead. For the portal environment, for the existing Silverlight portal, definitely limit icons that you're using. That's going to cause a lot of problems. And then consider using a start page that actually links to the sub-items to improve performance there as well. Also, scope request offerings, so you're actually accessing very specific amounts of data. Try not to return like 10,000 items within a request offering. It doesn't provide you with the best performance when it's returning all that data to one request offering. Make sure you're using queryable type content. And I have some links in here on how to do that. Disable the app pool recycling on high memory usage. I've run into a lot of companies where they have, basically what it means is your app pool keeps consuming data, right? There's a setting in IIS that when your app pool runs out of resources, it recycles. When does it run out of resources? When you have the most users in it. So if you have app pool recycling on, what ends up happening is you've got all your users in the system, and all of a sudden the app pool recycles, causing everybody to get this like spinning circular please wait icon. You don't want that. So make sure you disable app pool recycling on high resource of memory. Use searching and request offerings. You can go read that blog and figure out how to do that. And then also use known information like filtering rather than just providing people searching the content that exists in the CMDB. Use filters to be able to make your returns from your request offerings smaller. Okay, workflow optimization. I know I'm doing this a little fast, but I'm trying to make sure I get all this content in. Use dedicated servers and Azure automation. Do not have your workflow server, especially unless you're like a kind of smallish environment, don't have your workflow server also be the server you're using for your consoles. Make sure that's a dedicated server that your workflows are hitting. So your workflows, internal SCSM workflows are running on, when you install it, they're running on the first installed management server. If you are looking for performance to be great, make sure that that stays there and make sure that your consoles are using another box. Also, if you're using something like Azure Automation or Orchestrator to pull data back from Service Manager, make sure that's also targeting a server other than your workflow server and also targeting a server other than your console servers. That allows you to isolate the performance needs and make sure they're all placed within the appropriate buckets. You can do this today also with Azure Automation on on-prem implementation by targeting it to the runbook worker, and the runbook worker then talks to your on-prem instance. Or if you put it in Azure, a similar kind of experience would be necessary. But with the new Visual Designer, I'm definitely pointing everybody toward this location. A couple things to consider doing within the environment. If you are seeing some performance issues with your workflows, and I'll show you how to determine if you're having performance issues with your workflows. First, consider disabling implied permissions. There's that particular workflow happens to take up a pretty significant amount of performance. It wasn't written real well. So you can disable that and won't have a whole lot of negative effects. Actually, you won't have any negative effects as far as I've seen. You can also disable this priority calculation rule because you can get that SLO calculator without it. You can disable the set first assigned relationship add rule without any negative effects, and then you can also limit SLO application then as a result of that. So SLOs can then be applied through less complex rule matrices. So what I find is companies might define 50 different ways they want to define SLOs. Well, those SLOs then run against every incident in the system. So if you want to optimize the performance of SLO application, what you do is you limit that to say, I've got 3 different types of SLOs that I'm applying, and then those then calculate against my different relationships. So limit the quantity of them in order to optimize that performance. There's a really fantastic blog post on how to troubleshoot a problematic workflow. I'm not going to go into it today because I don't have enough time to demo it, but follow these. Basically, what there's a set of queries that allows you to determine where the watermark is in the workflow processing. So what happens is, as you do writes in Service Manager, it basically backs up an entire list of work items that require a workflow to run against them, they basically become queued in a gigantic interior backlog in the system. And there's a watermark that tells Service Manager where it's at. So this allows you to discern, do I have a workflow that I wrote that's running really poorly? Like let's say I totally misconfigured it, and it's running in a way that's not optimal, and it's running against all these different the work items, and I need to eliminate it. What you can do is you can actually artificially move the watermark to be able to get around it, and then you can remove the management pack, right? So the way this works is only move the watermark at last resort, because what's going to happen is that's going to skip everything else that's valuable in the system too. So take some time and read through troubleshooting workflow performance, and you'll learn a whole lot about how the interior of Service Manager works, and then how you can troubleshoot those performance delays if you happen to do something that wasn't appropriate in the system. Okay. Connectors. When to use Orchestrator? For Orchestrator, I tend to use it more often than not, honestly. And the reason I do that is because I love using the Visual Designer, and I love defining these workflows in a way that I have more control over in an easy way. You can also now use Azure Automation for that same purpose. High capacity is a particular example of that. I found that when I switched to using Orchestrator and Azure Automation for a lot of my more important workflows, I'm able to do things faster. And it's really the appropriate place to be putting a lot of this kind of operation anyway. You can transition from a monitor object to a get initiation. Gets and monitors essentially do polling against the environment versus triggering within Service Manager, then calls the external workflow system. Both are great. Both work fine. Probably the recommended way is to use the connector, but you can also go back to the other way of doing it, which is a polling mechanism to look for status changes. Both are totally legit ways to go about doing workflows against your system. All right, here's a couple examples on how to use notifications. So you can use I blog in there on how to actually go about doing that, and then you have these two different options for going about kicking off your workflows. For kind of connectors, two really important things to do. Constrain the synchronization to the things that are important to you, and then finally, more important than not, disable null sync. So in your connectors, there's a little configuration that says do not sync null values on connectors. Those connectors will end up fighting with each other if you don't have the null button checked. So your Active Directory connector and your SCCM connector will, every time they sync, basically one of them will set a value and the other one will unset the value, and they'll just keep doing this in a forever process. And I was like, why are these things taking so long? It was because one had the data and one didn't, and they kept fighting with each other. So I disabled the null values because it's totally pointless to synchronize the null value anyway. So that, make sure you check that box. The DCM workflow. The DCM workflow is a beast. If you're using it in a sort of smallish environment, then it works great. If you have 13,000 systems that are not DCM compliant, your system will grind to a halt and it won't work very well. So you can disable that particular workflow, and there's a lot of other ways to do that without using that particular workflow. So that can be disabled. For the connector there's a connector performance issue with Active Directory. When you connect to Active Directory and you switch domain controllers, it wants to synchronize the whole directory again. We used to have to fix that with some DNS tricks. That's no longer the case. That's actually improved in UR6. So kudos to the team for nailing that one. That was a big pain in the butt, especially if you have a big Active Directory. And there's also a way to sync custom variables. They're not synced out of box, but if you do need to synchronize those variables, those can be brought over through, there's a nice little blog here on how to actually go about doing that. Okay, you can also do some additional scheduling capabilities. That's all done in the XML, or you can use Orchestrator to be able to turn the jobs on and off. I actually favor using Orchestrator to turn the jobs on and off. But you can configure it within Orchestrator, or within the XML of the connector configuration as well. Finally, you can tweak the batch size of the connector to synchronize more items in a particular run. Or not just synchronize, but also run more work items through a workflow in a particular run. If you're building your own workflows and you need to be able to improve the performance of those, you can change that batch size. All right, last thing. This is probably the coolest thing, actually. Maximizing business value with business intelligence. Use Power BI for your visualizations, or Power View, which is the on-premise implementation of Power BI, but Power BI is way cooler. So you can connect Power BI to your on-premise implementation very, very easily. There's two blogs here on how to actually go about doing that. Here's what the actual topology looks like. So on the left-hand side over here, we have our CMDB or our data warehouse. Both of those are kind of legit places to get your content. If you're querying your CMDB, I always recommend that you're using a always-on secondary to pull that data from instead of the primary. And also, I recommend that you're using snapshotting, which means you don't pull it every single time. If you're using a data warehouse, great. So with Power BI, what you basically have is you have an analysis services server that probably was installed when you installed Service Manager, except you're installing it in what's called tabular mode. And tabular mode allows you to do things a lot faster than a cube. So what you end up doing is you have a tabular model that gets put on to that analysis services server. Don't be scared. It's not that difficult. And then you have a software gateway that's installed through Power BI. That's also really easy. So you install a software gateway on your analysis services server, and that will pump data into Power BI, and then you can visualize it in really cool ways. So this configuration takes maybe an hour to set up. Really not that time intensive, but you can get some really significant value out of it. So let's demo it, and I'll show you how it works. And I need to switch my connector. There we go. All right. So this looks a lot cooler than the out-of-box SSRS reports, doesn't it? This is Power BI. We have two principal environments. We have our Power BI preview kind of main website, and then I also have an app for dashboards that exists on my site as well. Both of these environments are available now. You can go out and install them, and you can get some pretty significant value from them. So I've set up a dashboard for my Power BI environment. It contains various dashboards that are important to me, and it also contains other things that are not System Center oriented. So this really becomes a hub for business intelligence within your environment, not just for System Center, but for other things too. So when I'm going about adding a data set, first thing I need to do is add data to this system, okay? So I'm going to click Add, and you can see all the different places I can get data from. I can get data from SQL Server Analysis Services, VSO. I can get it from Dynamic CRM. There's a lot of great places to get that data. Where we're interested is SQL Server Analysis Services. So I click Connect, and what it's going to do is it's going to give me this list of my SQL servers that I've registered with Power BI. So up here in the right-hand corner, there is a little, here we go, Analysis Services connector. Okay? So what you do is you go on your SQL server and you log into Power BI and you click on that, and you can then download the Analysis Services connector, which you install on your server. And then it asks you for a bunch of information like your subscription and your name and your account you wanted to use. And what you get as a result of that is it shows up here within the Service Manager environment. Oh, excuse me, the Power BI environment. And what I'm connecting to is this, what's called Analysis Services Data Visualization environment. And this is, the Analysis Services allows me to construct a tabular model, pull that data back. So in my particular case, what I'm doing is I have a query. This is my query that I'm pulling data from. In this case, my CMDB, but it could be my data warehouse. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new project. And I'm going to create Analysis Services Tabular Project. I'm going to call it SM Demo 05. Okay. Okay. So then I'm going to import from the data source, and I can pull lots of different places to get this data, but I just happen to be pulling it from SQL Server, and my server name is Cincy SM3 SQL. Don't hack me. All right, we'll go test this connection. Great. And then what you'll look for is your Service Manager database or your DW database, whichever one you're pulling from. And then you have to enter your credentials. Okay. Really, I think this is... Okay, and we're going to write the query. So I'm pulling that, put it right in there, validate that it fits and it works. Great, says SQL statement's valid. Oopsie daisies. And then click Finish. And it's going to import that data. And you can run this on a reoccurring pattern. So you can say, every 2 minutes, run this. Right? So you can set this reoccurring pattern where it pulls this data back. So you can see what it's done is it's pulled this data that now becomes available to me. So this gets saved. You basically build this and deploy it. That deploys it to my analysis services environment. And then it shows up here. And then I have my actual connection right here. And then when I'm designing it, I actually pull that data in, and it basically shows up on the right, and I can pull that data into my overall environment. I've got a minute left. And then in here, I can actually expose that data. So this is data that happens to come from my CMDB. But let's show you something that's more like the work items. Pull that back here. There we go. So this is the work item data that's being pulled back. So I've got a nice little graph here. I've got a nice distribution of active, resolved, and closed. And I've got a nice ability to select the person who's working on it and who's there. And then what I can do is I can actually go about editing the report. So this is the data that gets pulled back from my query. And I can actually drag and drop this data into the fields. So I could say, bring this and create a new area here. Add my affected user. Add a work item. Maybe I'm actually not interested in that. I can start to add that data into the overall environment. Created by user. Oops, daisy, that won't work. And it's very drag and drop kind of style. If you've used Excel to create visualizations before, it's just as easy as using Excel. So this is something that you should be able to go out and configure today and get immediate value from if you have data that exists within your Service Manager environment. And here's why you're going to be able to configure it today. Because, main PowerPoint. Because you have these two blog post links right here that will allow you to actually walk through configuring it. So Rob did a really nice job of actually building that out and showing you how to do it. And behind that, there's a whole bunch of other links on configuring Power BI and Power View if you're doing it on-premise. And then also the types of queries you can use to get the data out of your system and then report it back out. So that's something that I would suggest that you make part of your deployment, because using SSRS is not really probably the most beautiful way to be able to provide your executives the information they need to make decisions. All right, so my time is up, and we've gotten exactly to the end of my content. And here you go.
So thank you, everybody. So the perfume, or at least scale environments that Nate talked about, I'm very impressed about that. We are trying to take most of this knowledge and the best practices and set some smart defaults as we go in subsequent URs. You see that's going to happen. As time passes, we're going to make less and less of these as defaults. But right now, this is a great asset. This information will be available for you as you download it, and you'll be able to get that and all the blogs and everything else. So free to go hit us up. This is something that we're committed to make sure it happens, and you extract the maximum value from your system. And hopefully I'll see you next time around in different conferences. But do show up in our monthly sessions. We have monthly meetings. That's the best way, I think, we interact with our teams. And most importantly, I get the feedback from those things to prioritize the workloads. And so far, the last six URs, UR2 to UR6, we made significant improvements. And we want to actually drive down more and more of those bite-sized nuggets come down in UR pipes. And we are even contemplating trying to see if we can get monthly URs out. It's still very early discussions, because you don't have to wait 3 months. You can actually get it in a month. They'll all be continuously, seamlessly upgradable. So look for some kind of a faster cadence as well. So thank you, everybody. I know I'm keeping you between you and your flight. So enjoy the rest of Ignite if you're there. But I'm really humbled, and thank you for being here.